Hey guys, in honor of moving to the new location, next week will be the start of our beginner meat rabbit series where we go through building a rabbitry from the ground up. But in order to give you something this week that I think you might enjoy, I'm condensing the popular How to Feed Your Meat Rabbit series into one mega video. It's all the same content, just in an easier to digest format. Hopefully this will allow people who want to listen to it or watch it straight through an easier way rather than having to click through all the different videos. Either way guys, I hope you appreciate it. Thanks so much for watching, and here's the video. How's it going guys? Sam from West Meadow Rabbits here, and today I'm going to do a three-part mini-series on what to feed meat rabbits. The diet of your meat rabbit is probably going to be one of the most important considerations that you're going to have during the course of your project, because what you feed them is going to directly affect your meat output, the quality of your breeding stock, and the quality of your animals. That being said, a lot of people get into meat rabbits for self-sufficiency and because they don't necessarily trust the industrial food system, rightfully so in a lot of cases. So a lot of people are interested in feeding non-commercial food to meat rabbits. So we'll get into that in a later video, but this first one is just going to be a general overview of what you can feed a meat rabbit and what a good meat rabbit diet looks like. So right off the bat, you pretty much guarantee to have seen this right here. This is commercially pelleted rabbit feed. Now, commercially pelleted rabbit feed is technically a complete diet. You could feed them only pellets and they should do okay. In a lot of cases, they'll do really well. However, that being said, not all pellets are created equal, and I usually don't recommend feeding just pellets for the backyard person. So, to briefly get into commercial pellets here, they're going to be the most expensive feed option on the table. They are manufactured usually from various food making byproducts and alfalfa. That's the primary ingredients. So they're not really directly competing with humans for food from a commercial pellet, which is a lot of people's concern. It's not like chickens where you're feeding valuable grain that you could be eating. Usually it's fibrous byproducts from processing grain and alfalfa, along with some trace vitamins. Now, the main thing that sets commercial pellets apart from one another is the protein content. So rabbit pellets typically come in 16% protein, 17%, and 18% protein concentrations. Each one is appropriate for a different type of situation. If you're just having a pet rabbit, or you have a buck who's just hanging out, or pretty much any buck for that matter because their jobs are very easy, or does that are mature and done growing but are not being bred, or any other rabbit for that matter, you can feed them 16% because they don't really need that extra protein. However, if you're heavily breeding your does or breeding your does at all, and any rabbits that you're trying to get growing, you know, whether that means they're growing to 8-week slaughter age or you're growing them up to be breeding stock, you really want to be feeding them 18% protein. That's going to give them that extra oomph to really build good quality flesh that you won't see with 16%. Besides that, it's going to really depend on where you are in the country. The brands vary greatly. I know Purina is pretty common nationally. Where I am, I use Blue Seal. But again, it's really going to depend on where you are. Basically, the better quality feed you have, the better results you're going to get with your rabbits as far as health, condition, looks, and growth rates. Now, for a lot of people, though, that's not the only concern when they're raising rabbits. They want to be getting a cheap source of meat, and they want to be getting a source of meat that isn't necessarily dependent on a commercial feed, which is where some other additives come in. So first, right off the bat, again, very common, we have hay. Hay is basically any dried grass or plant material that's not processed. It's just dried and then fed to the animals. Now, with your meat rabbits, even if you're feeding them pellets, it's good to feed them some hay because that acts as a source of roughage and really helps balance out their gut, which is very, very sensitive. It's got a lot of important bacteria in there that if they get thrown out of whack at all, can very quickly kill a rabbit. So hay is good regardless, even if you're feeding pellets. You shouldn't feed hay exclusively, but if you're feeding pellets or you're feeding other stuff, which we'll get to in a later video, either way, hay is a cornerstone of any good rabbit diet. Now, there's several different types of hay, which I'm going to get into in the next video, but suffice to say right now, we have two types on the table. This is orchard grass, which is essentially a type of grass like similar to what you would have in your yard. It's lower in protein, higher in fiber, and generally what I feed to rabbits that I'm giving pellets to, because it sort of helps counteract this really energy-dense, high-protein pellet by giving them some roughage and what I would say is the human equivalent of, fiber. Good for your diet. Alfalfa is not technically a grass, it's a legume, like a pea or a bean, and as a result, it's very rich in protein and very high in energy. Now, you'll hear a lot of mixed things on the internet about alfalfa. But basically, any pellet you have is going to be primarily made of alfalfa. And I'll get into feeding alfalfa in the next video, along with a couple other types of hay. So we'll just leave that off to the side. And the third option you have as far as feeding rabbits is greens and or forage and scraps. So this is basically anything that's not hay or pellets. So that typically, for most people, is going to be backyard grasses, tree leaves, vegetable trimmings, older vegetables, possibly some forest products, depending on what kind of trees you have in your yard. You know, sunflower seeds is a very common food additive, whole grain, and that again is a subject for another separate video. But when feeding when feeding greens, it's really important that you start slow introducing them to greens, especially when they're babies, because their digestive system is much more sensitive. Once they're adults, they can pretty much take anything. And then you just introduce the greens slowly, and you can feed them a lot. As you can see, this is actually being filmed on top of one of my rabbit tractors, where the grow outs go around the yard and eat grass, and that reduces my feed bill by about 80%, and the rabbits are happier. Now, they take about maybe a week longer to reach the weight I want, but again, that's more than made up for with the less feed they're eating and the quality of life that they have, which is really important to me. So now that's sort of the outline of what a good diet looks like. I'm going to go into the nuances of each in the coming videos that I'll link to. But with that being said, if you find yourself in a shit hits a fan kind of situation, end of the world, or I'm being exaggerating really, just you can't afford commercial pellets, or you don't have access to it, that doesn't mean that rabbits are no good. As a matter of fact, they can easily survive off of much, much worse than what I'm showing here. You know, my girlfriend's great-grandmother was a Greek immigrant, and they raised meat rabbits in basically tiny little sheds, and they fed them literally kitchen scraps. Now, is that ideal for the rabbits? No. It's not necessarily the highest quality diet. You're not going to get the most meat, and you're not going to get the happiest rabbit, but it'll keep them alive, and it will give you a source of meat. So while I would recommend that when you have the resources available, you feed your rabbit as best as you can, you should know that rabbits still make a great choice as a preparedness option, because if you don't have access to these higher quality foods, they can survive off of very little. Now, with that being said, I should mention really quick a couple things you cannot feed a rabbit. First off, do not feed them any obviously well-known poisonous plants. That's milkweed, you know, poison ivy, stuff like that. Should not be fed to rabbits. For a complete list, you can easily Google it. There's a lot of veterinarians on the internet that have a complete list of what you can and can't feed. Now, with that being said, you may hear some things about alfalfa. Alfalfa is okay to feed. I will discuss that in the next video. Another thing you'll hear often is you shouldn't feed bread or food scraps that are very high in energy, very processed, and that's mostly true. I wouldn't do it under anything but the most desperate circumstances. Again, if you don't have access to any food for some reason, there's a natural disaster, or I don't know, some government collapses, obviously exaggerating, but then it's okay to feed them whatever you have, because it's a survival situation, and they will survive, they just won't thrive, and you'll have higher mortality, etc., etc. But stay away from anything that's obviously poisonous. Quick search on the internet will tell you that. Stay away from most fruits. That's not a good idea for rabbits, with the notable exception of apples. Apples can actually be really good to rabbits if you feed them in moderation. Now again, vets are going to tell you no sugary foods whatsoever, but if you're in an area where you have a lot of apples, you have a small farm, you have some apple trees, some falls from the tree that are kind of low quality, you can cut off the nasty parts, give it to the rabbits. Even better, if you're making applesauce, rabbits love apple peels. So most fruits should be avoided. Apples can be fed in moderation. They should never make up more than 10% of the diet, and that's even kind of high. But that being said, it's a good treat, and I will get into all the other things besides your basic spread you have here in another video. So just to recap though, a good diet is going to be based on commercial pellets when you have them. You're not going to free feed commercial pellets except to does that are lactating and have babies, or babies that you're trying to get to a certain age. After that, once they're adults and they're mature, you can usually get away with about a tuna fish can worth of pellets, although it depends on the feed you're feeding, and it depends on the weather, which is something I forgot to mention actually. Higher quality feed that's 18% protein is going to have more energy, so you can feed less of it. In the winter, you're going to need to feed more, because the rabbit is going to be using a lot more energy to produce body heat. In the summer, you can feed a little less. Generally use the rabbit as your guide. If they're tearing down the feeder trying to get at your food, you're not feeding them enough. Similarly, if you come back the next day after feeding time and you notice there's food still in the tray, cut back a little bit. But that should be the gist of it for feeding rabbits. It's pretty straightforward. It goes without saying that they should have access to clean, fresh water all times, even in the winter. That means you might have to go out and bang out the ice crocs, but that's pretty common sense, I think, for most people who have been involved with animals. So the next video I'm going to do is talking about the different types of hay, and the last video I'm going to do is talking about different types of roughage. So stay tuned, guys. I'll be linking to it below. And if you like these videos, please like, comment, subscribe, and share with me anything you'd like answered or anything you'd like me to go into in more detail. So until next time, guys, thanks a lot. Hey guys, sorry to interrupt the video, but I just wanted to let you know about the West Meadow Rabbit's Patreon. While YouTube is great and I love being a part of the community here, it does have some downsides that I think Patreon solves nicely. Over on the Patreon, you can get early access to all our YouTube videos, transcripts, exclusive content, detailed information about raising rabbits in different formats such as blog posts. In the future, we're going to have higher tiers with even better content like my exclusive rabbit cage plans and even more exclusive content. In the meantime, though, it is an absolutely phenomenal way to support the channel. Like I said, YouTube's great, but some of my most important videos, like how to process meat rabbits, get demonetized, and I really like the intimate community we can have over on Patreon. If you can afford just an extra cup of coffee a month, I would love to see you on the Patreon. Either way, guys, don't feel pressured. I wouldn't be here without you. Your support is awesome, and I want you above all to keep enjoying the videos, and thank you so much for watching. How's it going, guys? Sam from West Meadow Rabbits here. In today's video, I'm continuing my 3-part series on what to feed rabbits. If you missed the first video, you can go ahead and click back there to look at it. It gives you a broad overview of a good diet for rabbits. But today we're going to discuss hay specifically. So as I mentioned in the previous video, hay is any dried plant material that isn't processed in any way, and it's just fed to the rabbits after it's dried. So there's really three main types of hay on the market that you'll see. And all of them are appropriate for rabbits, but in different circumstances. I have 2 of the 3 here. The first one I'm going to start with is orchard grass, or grass hay, as it's typically called. And as you can see by this bundle I have here, it's really just dried blades of grass. It's got some seed heads on it, which the rabbits really enjoy. And occasionally you'll get some weeds, which, believe it or not, the rabbits really like. And so I use this because it's got a good diversity to it as far as plant material, although technically orchard grass is just one species. In addition, orchard grass is lower in protein and pretty good amount of energy, but not as high energy as some other hays. It's a good sort of middle of the road hay that gives you a lot of fiber, a lot of nutrients without too much energy and too much protein. So you could feed orchard grass hay to a rabbit that's on pellets. As a matter of fact, that's what I do. When my rabbits eat pellets, they get a good handful about this size every morning, and they get their pellets in the evening. And that sort of ensures that their digestive system is working properly. Rabbits have a digestive system based on fermentation, sort of like a cow, but less complicated. And it's got a very delicate balance. And in order to feed that bacteria, you need to provide basically fiber, very similar to a human, actually. So this will do that for you. Another really common type of hay that's similar to orchard grass in a lot of ways is Timothy hay. Again, there's not that many differences between orchard grass and Timothy hay. It's just another species of grass. It tends to have a little less weeds in it, which is actually why I don't use it. I think the weeds add a nice variety to the rabbit's diet, which I'll get to in the 3rd video. And it also is just usually more expensive. This is about usually the cheapest hay you can get, which would be $10 where I am for a 40-pound bale, which is a pretty good deal. That'll last you a while. So Timothy is very similar to this. It's just slightly more expensive. Anybody who tells you that rabbits need Timothy hay or they need a specific type of hay, that's not true. Okay, and orchard grass and Timothy hay are basically the same thing. There's nothing special about Timothy. With that being said, for all hays, the nutrition does vary between each hay, but it also varies between cuttings of that hay. At different times of the year, usually you get more than one hay harvest, sort of like mowing a lawn. They do it 2 or 3 times a year. And different cuttings will have different nutritional properties. Now for the amateur and even most advanced people, that really doesn't matter that much, with the exception of alfalfa, which I'll get to in a sec. But for most other hays, it's not that big of a deal. The rabbit's not going to mind either way. Which brings us to the 3rd type of hay that's pretty common you'll see with livestock, and that's alfalfa. So as I mentioned in the other video, alfalfa is not actually a grass, it's a legume. So you can see you have these large stalks right here, and then you have this dusty stuff, which is really the dried leaves of the plants, and that's where most of the nutrition is. Got a bunch of dust right here. That is actually from the plant leaves, as I said, and a legume is much more rich in protein and energy than a grass. So as a result, alfalfa is much denser, it's much higher in protein, and it's much higher in energy. On the flip side though, it also has a lot of calcium in it, and rabbits are extremely efficient metabolizers of calcium, so they don't need a lot of calcium. So sometimes alfalfa can cause problems with the urinary tract in rabbits, sometimes, but usually not by itself. Usually there's other stuff going on. Incidentally also, any pelleted feed you're buying at the store is going to have alfalfa as its main ingredient. So that is something to take in consideration. Basically, what you want to do with hays is you have to either decide, is this going to be your cornerstone of your diet or a supplement? If you're feeding pellets, it's just a supplement. This good handful of Timothy or orchard grass hay is all they need in the morning to keep their roughage in good shape. You can even free feed it, which I think is ideal if you can get a nice hay manger that doesn't let it go to waste. But they will throw this around and a lot will fall through the cage and be wasted if you can't find a good way to contain it. Now alfalfa, if you're feeding pellets, should not be fed to rabbits unless they are breeding or they are babies that are just growing up. And by breeding I mean females specifically when they're pregnant and lactating. That'll give them that extra boost in addition to the pellets, and it'll give the babies that extra head start. But after the babies hit 10 to 16 weeks, you can stop feeding alfalfa and switch them over to this. You still leave them on free feed pellet, but alfalfa is really only necessary for rabbits under a lot of duress when they're really working hard. If you have a really high intensity breeding schedule, it can be useful there. Now also, on the flip side, if you're not feeding pellets or you're feeding very, very little pellets, alfalfa is going to make up a much bigger part of your rabbit's diet. That's where they're going to be getting most of their protein and energy from. It's going to act as that power source for the rabbit, and you'll be supplementing with other things, which I'll get to in the third video. We'll talk about feeding rabbits basically without pellets. But that's primarily what alfalfa is used for. So if you're pellet feeding, it's not much of a concern, except as a supplement for breeding does and young baby rabbits. However, if you're not pellet feeding, alfalfa is going to become much more important. Regardless of which route you choose, your rabbit should always have access to a decently high fiber hay such as orchard grass. They're going to need that to just maintain that gut health. And again, even if you're not feeding pellets, I still think you should have some access to this, and you can incorporate it with alfalfa however you want. But yeah, so those are the big things with hay. When you're buying hay, you want to look for fresher is better. Most feed stores will have when it was cut. Now that being said, you're in the middle of winter, you're not getting fresh hay, but you should look at it. It should be as green as possible, and it shouldn't look moldy. It shouldn't be wet to the touch. It should be nice and crunchy, dry, but green is awesome. So the greener your hay is, you know that it was dried quickly and it sealed in all those good nutrients before it was baled up. If it's got that brownish dead look to it, you might not have a choice, but it's not ideal. Similarly, it should not be dank. It should not have a moldy smell. It shouldn't be wet. I forgot to mention alfalfa will be significantly more expensive than orchard grass hay. And typically this is sold in 100-pound bales. So be ready to have a buddy if you're buying this. I think where I am, alfalfa goes for 40 pounds, a 100-pound bale. With that being said, that'll last me half a year, even with a lot of rabbits. The 40-pound bales go quicker, but I feed this a lot more freely. Sorry about that, my camera cut me off there. But again, feeding hay is pretty straightforward. I would not recommend buying hay online or from a pet store. It's going to be very small, it's not going to be economical, and those little bags, it's ridiculous. And it's usually not going to be that good quality either. Your best bet is to go to a feed store, buy it by the bale. And it's good to have on hand. You know, hay stores for a really long time, if you keep it dry and out of sunlight, it will last, and it'll provide you a good, reliable food source. So I hope you enjoyed this video, hope it was informative. If you have any more questions, or you'd like me to talk about something else, please leave a comment below. I'd be more than happy to talk with you. The next video will be about feeding rabbits without pellets, basically. And it's an interesting one, so I hope you head on over there and check it out. In the meantime, please be sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, guys, thanks a lot. How's it going, guys? Sam from West Meadow Rabbits here. And this is part 3 of my video series on feeding rabbits. And today we're going to talk about basically everything else you can feed a rabbit besides a pellet, and how to feed a rabbit without pellets. Now, full disclosure, I feed my rabbits a pellet-based diet. I know how to do a non-pellet-based diet in case I need to, for whatever reason, if I don't have access to feed. But for me, what I do, breeding rabbits for breeding stock and meat, I find better results when I have a pellet-based diet. That being said, I really like to supplement with natural stuff. I think it not only entertains the rabbits and provides a better quality of life, but it also provides more nutrition, because pellets have been formulated scientifically to be a complete diet, but there's a lot of compounds we don't know about. We still are discovering important compounds in plants for humans, let alone for animals. So I think it's wise to incorporate some of the more natural products a rabbit would be eating if it were off on its own in the wild. Now, I've said before, domestic rabbits are not close to wild rabbits, but there is some ways you can bring that into their diets to get some better results and save some money on feed. Now, if you were ever thinking of going fully off pellets, I strongly recommend this book here. It's called Beyond the Pellet. And this book, it's by Boyd Craven Jr. and Rick Warden. It's really interesting. It covers basically how to feed a complete diet without a pellet. And I'll mention some of the things I like to feed and things you could feed exclusively. But like I said, if you're looking for a detailed cover-to-cover explanation of feeding without pellets, I would get Beyond the Pellet. Here it is again. Beyond the Pellet. You can buy that online. Support your local store if you can find one. But yeah, that'll give you a good detailed explanation. So now let's get into it. Basically, when it comes to non-pelleted feeds, there's really 4 options. And if you're feeding a completely non-pelleted diet, you're going to be incorporating all 4. The first, which I mentioned in the previous video, is different types of hay, both legumes and grasses. Those are going to be the bulk of your diet if you're going non-pellet. It's going to provide you most of the energy, the protein, and other nutrients your rabbits are going to need. If you want to learn more about the hay, please click over back to that video if you haven't watched it yet, and it'll explain all that. The next biggest and probably most important part of the diet is going to be what you call your greens. Greens are basically any non-dried plant material. Hay, dried plant material. Greens, not dried plant material. Pretty straightforward. There's not that much of a difference between the two depending on what you're feeding. So you have your standard greens, which are not really any different from hay except that they're fresh, such as this basic grass from your backyard right here. It's perfectly fine. That's going to make up a lot of rabbit feed options out there. But you also have much more nutritious greens available to you, and I would recommend utilizing them heavily. So this is clover. Most of you are going to be familiar with clover. There's 2 varieties of clover that grow in my area. White clover, which gives you the little white flowers that are all over my yard except for where I'm standing, and that's going to be in your lawn. And then you'll see purple clover, which are these bigger plants that grow up and have the purple flowers. Both are legumes, both are very high in protein, both are very nutritious for your rabbit, and both have a good source of energy. So they're another really, really solid component of a rabbit diet. One lesser known good feeding material for rabbits, and incidentally is a notorious yard weed, it's called plantain. Not like the banana-shaped fruit, but this is the plantain. It's called common plantain. It grows these broad, dark green leaves. This is a very small plant, it's not mature. You can see the roots go down like this. In your yard, when it's a really annoying weed, it'll get huge. And it'll send up these little seed stalks once it's ready to go. It's a noxious weed. People usually spray Roundup on it to get rid of it, but it's free rabbit food, and it's an incredibly nutritious plant. It's got loads of minerals and vitamins. It's actually edible to humans, too. So don't spray it. Eat it. That's my philosophy for everything in your yard. Incidentally, weeds typically are more nutritious than basic yard plants, if you will, and are actually really good food sources both for rabbits and people. Which brings me to my next point here about greens. Basically, almost anything a person can eat, green-wise, a rabbit can eat. And that includes weeds. I really highly recommend you look into, foraging outdoors for yourself, but also any of those plants you forage, you can also feed to your rabbit. Another common weed I have is daisy fleabane. Perfect rabbit feed, and it's good in salads. So the list goes on as far as weeds go, but those are all great rabbit feeds. With the exception of milkweed and a couple other very poisonous weeds that are usually well known, they're basically poisonous to almost everything. You, me, rabbits, dogs, whatever. So you can do a quick Google search of poisonous weeds to avoid in your area, because it's going to depend on where you are. But for the most part, most weeds are actually really nutritious and make good feed. But you will notice rabbits prefer some things over others. Continuing on with greens, you have, of course, your standard greens that humans like to eat, although I wouldn't recommend feeding them to rabbits, because why are you going to waste your greens that you could be eating yourself on rabbits? That being said, spinach is really good. Rabbits love spinach. Kale, carrot tops, cabbage. Got to be careful with cabbage not to feed too much at once because it will bloat them. And that goes with all these greens. I should have mentioned that. It's better to feed a diversity of greens rather than a ton of one type, because that will prevent them from getting oversaturated with whatever nutrient that green has. So all those vegetables, and if you're Italian or from the Mediterranean like myself, you will also know about dandelion, which is a really popular food in those countries, and it's actually a fantastic rabbit feed. Rabbits go nuts for it, but it's also delicious for yourself, so you may not want to give it to them. And basically the list goes on for those types of greens. The third type of food you can give to rabbits is what I would call the starchies. Starchies, that's cute. Starches and like grainy type things. So that's going to be your root crops, which you shouldn't feed heavily. Your grains, again, not to be fed heavily. They really should not make up a large part of your rabbit's diet. Some common grains people do are oats and sunflower seeds, which can be really good for rabbits if you know what you're doing and you supplement in the right ways. But that's too much to explain in a video. So again, check out the book, check out online if you're looking for that. But that's just, those are possibilities, and they will make up an important part. So in addition, you have your root crops like beets, carrots. It's pretty, I don't know, for whatever reason, bunnies got associated with carrots. They do really like carrots, but they like any root crop because it's sugary. But you shouldn't feed them too much. The higher the sugar content is, the more carefully you're going to want to feed it. Is a good rule for rabbits. So carrots, beets, that kind of stuff you can feed, but you should feed it sparingly. Same thing, radishes you can feed a little bit more. I also feed, you know, all my greens from my root crops, beet greens, carrot greens. They really enjoy that stuff. So you can spread it out there too. And as I mentioned in the first video, this would also include in this category apples. Apples, rabbits love apples. You got to feed them sparingly, and you may not want to feed them the flesh itself because you can use that. But apple cores and apple peels are fantastic supplement for rabbits. It's a good treat. I find it actually kind of boosts their vigor a little bit if you feed it sparingly, you know. No more than a quarter of an apple a day, a rabbit. But I usually feed that in scraps like cores and peels. So that's another really good supplement. And bringing that around to the subject of trees, that's your fourth category. I bet you did not know this because it's sort of a lost art, but your best supplier of hay is not the ground, but trees. In medieval Europe and older Europe, people didn't harvest a ton of grass hay because, number one, it was incredibly time consuming. Number two, the land in a lot of those areas didn't want to be grass. It wanted to be forest. So there's actually a term that's slipping my mind right now, but it's basically leaf hay. Leaf hay has been practiced for hundreds of years all over the world, where you would basically harvest the leaves of trees and use that and store that and dry it, and that would be your hay, and that would be your fodder for your animals throughout the winter. There are a ton of awesome trees to feed rabbits. So again, this will depend on your area. If you're in the middle of a grassland, you might be better off with grass hay. But if you're in a forested area like me, there are some really awesome trees you can feed your rabbits. Number one on my list, it's technically considered invasive in some areas, but it is native to the US, is the black locust. This is a generally disliked tree. It's scraggly, it tends to grow in really polluted or disturbed areas. Super tough, super drought resistant, has thorns on it, but it's a sustainable junkie's best friend. They produce amazing flowers that pollinators love. Their leaves are highly nutritious, full of protein and energy. But here's the kicker. This is a tree, but it's also a legume, just like a bean or a clover. So it's actually fixing nitrogen in the ground around it. It's taking disturbed and polluted land and making it more fertile just by being there. On top of that, its wood is ridiculously awesome for firewood. It's completely resistant to rot. It'll last for 40 years sitting on wet ground in some cases. And it's as hard as an oak, but it grows probably 3 times as fast, which is the greatest thing about black locust. You can plant it everywhere. You can whack it down at the end of the year. You can feed the twigs and all to your rabbits, and it'll be back up the next year. So black locust is an amazing tree. If you have it near you, it's got so many uses. I strongly recommend you check it out. But some other common trees that you could feed to rabbits. Aspen is a really good one. I know ash is another really nice one. Alder. Where I am, a lot of those species, bug on my back, a lot of those species aren't as common as they used to be, but we do have a ton of maple around here. Maple's a good leaf. It's not top of the line, but it's really solid. The rabbits love it because it's decently sugary. And something a lot of people will feed their rabbits is oak leaves. While oak leaves aren't necessarily that nutritious, oak has a lot of tannins in it, and some people say that the tannins actually help reduce the parasite load in rabbits. So I feed it. They love it. I tend to go off of what my rabbits like. If you put a bunch of stuff down, you'll notice they gravitate towards some things right away. And I do believe that animals, to some extent, know what they need. I mean, even humans, we have these cravings sometimes, and we don't understand why, and I think it's because partially our body knows the nutrients we need. And I'm not saying perfectly, I'm not some woo-woo new age thing that, you know, guide your instincts to whatever, because for me that would just be Twinkies and cookies and stuff. But there's definitely something to be said for sort of letting the rabbit follow its instincts. So again, this is probably the longest one of this series, and it could be longer. But tree leaves are good, twigs are good, fruit branches, any fruit tree leaves they'll go nuts for. They'll eat the twigs too if you give them to them. They're really small twigs. They love that stuff. So that's some great options. But again, I can't go into everything and how to create a complete diet from the ground up, because that would probably take 2 hours. Or you can just read this book. This book's really good. There's also a ton of great resources on the internet that will give you information in regards to that. But I'm going to wrap up this here because it's already getting long. So I hope you enjoyed my 3-part series on how to feed rabbits and what to feed rabbits. And if you have any questions, please leave a comment. If you have any suggestions for future videos, I'd be more than happy to make them and interact with you guys. So be sure to comment below. And if you enjoyed these videos, please like, subscribe, share with your friends. I'm really trying to get this channel off the ground, spread the message of sustainability and sustainable meat production. So your help in that would be greatly appreciated. But until next time, guys, thanks a lot, stay safe, and good luck with your rabbits.